الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. Hope everyone is doing well. So this is our 10th lecture, and inshallah now that we've kind of mentioned with the previous lectures and also with the reading that you would have done, it kind of prepares us to go into a bit more examples. So it's all great when we talk about these things in theory. So theoretically, we have these taqsim al-masail. Theoretically, we know that who these imams were, and so we have all of these kind of principles that we've kind of highlighted. But and of course, you'll be studying fiqh as well, so that you can see the application there. But I want to want to dedicate a few sessions to doing case studies, because with case studies, the principles would really start to manifest itself. Because in theory, we mentioned this before about theory and practical, right? So that's why what we're going to be looking at in today's session are going to be some women-related masail in the Hanafi madhab. And so what are the three? They're going to be the discussion of niqab. So hopefully we can do it in 3 segments. If not, then only 2, and then maybe we'll discuss one next session. But will be the niqab in the Hanafi madhab. Then we'll be looking at women riding horses, right? And or camels, whatever animal it will be. And number 3, we'll be looking at and the third topic was women cutting hair, right? So these are 3 topics, and once because of the way we've highlighted the structure of the madhab, we want to be looking at stuff like, okay, what does a Zahiri riwayah say? Is there anything in the Nawadir? Is there anything in the Fatawa, the Mashayikh? Okay, if there is or isn't, what did the other Mashayikh say? What did the Ashabu, are there Ashabu Tarjih in that Tarjih has been given? What's the nature of that? Can we object to it? Where does our role come into it? So these are going to be, much more of the complications and the difficulties that come about with the practicality of these issues will be discussed, and you will see that a lot of the principles, these cases don't simply fit neatly into any given principle. So that's what we're looking at in today's session. So hopefully it'll be quite interesting. And then in the coming sessions, we'll look at other case studies to do with how things may change based on urf or na'ada, umul balwa, and so on and so forth. Our first discussion is going to be regarding the niqab. Now, because we don't have, this is pre-recorded, and this is not being recorded on Zoom or something, so I can't upload material. So what I'll do is I'll give you citations of these, and I'll give you some readings as well, that you can find a lot of these references therein. But I'm going to try to summarize the discussion. Each of these topics, by the way, I usually dedicate in other classes, like a session, sometimes 2-3 sessions per topic, because a lot of it can be conversation based as well. But for our purposes here, just going to try to highlight some of the brief complexities and difficulties that come about. So niqab, just so we can be on the same page with our definitions, is in reference to the face covering for women, right? So when we say niqab, it refers to the face covering for women. So you can use other words. You'll find taqdiyatul wajh, right, rather than niqab. There's just other terms that are used. In that, so there's a couple of questions that need to be highlighted. So first things first, because as a jurist of a madhab, you first want to know what the madhab says, as Imam al-Nawawi said, and this is something we're going to be kind of concluding on in the sessions, inshallah, which is the place of taqleed and ijtihad. But as Nawawi said, that for the mufti who's ascribed to a madhab, then the position of the imam is like how the Quran and Sunnah is for the mujtahid. So if you're following a madhab, you're saying the first question as the mufti or an alim within a madhab to say, what did Imam Abu Hanifa, what did Imam Shafi'i, and so on and so forth say regarding this issue? That's the first thing, because the whole idea of you being ascribed to a madhab and following a mujtahid is that I am not competent enough, I'm not capable enough to refer back to the Quran and Sunnah, so therefore I'm going to go to my Imam and see what they've said. Now, of course, this makes sense in a very simplistic form, But practically speaking, you will see many a times a mufti will be engaging with the Quran and Sunnah. Right, that happens. But anyway, let's put that aside a second. So now, as a Hanafi jurist, the first thing I'm looking at, and the reason I say this because someone say, well, shouldn't the first thing is to look at what the Quran and Sunnah said? Well, of course, but the whole idea of ascribing to a madhab is to say that what is in terms of how did they interpret the Quran and Sunnah when it came to this topic. That's the whole purpose of it. When you say, what did Imam Hanifa say? In essence, you're saying, how did he understand the Quran and Sunnah when it comes to the topic of or any given topic? So now, the first question you have is that the face covering, is it awra or not? Meaning, is it something that a woman must cover? Does it come under the thing that needs to be covered or not? What was Imam Abu Hanifa and Sahibain's qawl on this topic? And where does it come, if it does come? Remember, we have to have the taqsim al-masail. So, in this case, we have right from the very early on, from the highest source in the madhab, which is Zahiri Riwayah, in Kitab al-Asl of Imam Muhammad, in Kitab al-Istihsan. There's a reason why this is an Istihsan, but we're not going to discuss that now. In Kitab al-Istihsan, the Imam Muhammad presents the position of Imam Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf, which is, he's asked the question that is it allowed for a man to look at a woman, right, and specifically to the face and hands? So Imam Abu Hanifa responds by saying, yes, it is allowed. Right, you can look at the face and hands as long as it's not done out of shahwa. If it's done out of shahwa, then he must lower his gaze. And then for vice versa as well, but we're looking at the specific topic of niqab here. So it's very clear that it's allowed for a man to look at a woman's face and hands as long as the man is not doing it out of shahwa. The clear implication being is that the woman's face and hands don't need to be covered. Right? The woman's face and hands don't need to be covered. Therefore, it can be looked at. And that's an interpretation of the verse of the Quran. وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتُهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا, that a woman will not expose her adornments except that which is apparent. And that which is apparent has been narrated from the Sahaba, such as Aisha anha, Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma, saying that zinatul, so that's the kuhal and khatam. The kuhal will be the zinatul wajh, so it refers to the face, and the ring refers to zinatul yad, is the beauty of the hand. So the hand and face are exempt. So this is the interpretation of Imam Hanifa and the early Hanafis. So therefore, Zahiri Riwayah is very clear that the face does not need to be covered. The face does not need to be covered. Now, is there any alternative view out there within Zahiri Riwayah which says to the contrary? We'll come back to that in a second, right? So what is explicit of where the discussion is taking place is that the face and hands are not awra, and no one's going to argue for that. Is there anything in this in the Nawadir on the face and hands specifically? Not that I'm aware of. And is there anything on this on the Fatawa of the Mashayikh, meaning from like books of Fatawa Nawazil? Again, I'm not too I'm not sure if there is anything in these kind of books that have explicitly mentioned the hukm here, but they're very explicit. What is very explicit rather is that it's not awra, right? That you will find consistently, right? If it's not awra, that means it can be uncovered. That's the assumption. Okay, so if it's not awra, the assumption is it can be uncovered. Imam Maturidi, right? So now we're moving into the early 4th century, late 3rd century. It is that Wilat Ahl Sunnah, he discusses the topic of the face covering. And after mentioning in the verse of the Quran the interpretation of Imam Abu Hanifa, he puts forward the potentiality or the situation of a young girl. Right? A young girl, should she cover her face or not? So Imam Maturidi says that she should cover her face, but not because it's wajib and that she's sinful if she doesn't, but because of fitna. Now here what's interesting is that if you're looking at our sources, this is a tafsir work, right? It's not a fiqh book, it's a tafsir work of Imam Maturidi. So straight away we've got two issues here. Is that in our taqsim of the mujtahideen, Imam Maturidi doesn't come up in those as examples. Where does he situate? And nor am I aware of any of the Hanafi scholars discussing Imam Maturidi in terms of where he situates himself amongst the mujtahideen. So therefore, this is something which is still open for us to decide where he fits in. Number two, when discussing the sources for the Hanafi madhab, the Ta'wilat Ahl Sunnah, which is his tafsir work, is not found anywhere mentioned as being a source. Not because it wasn't a source in terms of that it's not credible, but the fact that that's not the place they would go, right, to cite fiqh positions. But what we do have here is a relatively early Hanafi discussing and saying that because of fitna, it will be encouraged for young women to cover, but not an obligation. Okay, encouraged but not an obligation. What did the fiqh book say? Right? Now, if you look at many of the later Hanafi fiqh books, and there's two works that I will cite here. Number one is the book in English by Marion Katz, which is Women in the Masjid, which discusses this topic across the madhabs, and you'll find a lot of these positions highlighted in great detail there. And then there's another book which is called At-Tahayyuz by Sheikh Ahmed Salim and Amr Basyuni. It's called At-Tahayyuz, which is a critique of At-Tarifi's book on the issue of face covering. That's in Arabic. Both these works have a lot of these citations there. So they're both, I'm not sure I'm Marion Katz, but the Tahayyuz is available online. You can find all these citations, inshallah. So there's no, if you're unsure about anything that's been mentioned. But what quite clearly happens in the Hanafi madhab is, and it's not just the Hanafi madhab, but we're going to restrict ourselves to there, is that a lot of the Hanafi scholars, they start holding on to the position that because of fitna, face covering should be wajib. Face covering should be wajib because of fitna, not because of awra. That's an important distinction. So when talking about awra, they're very clear that the awra of a woman is the face and hands are not from the awra. But when it comes to covering due to fitna, the face must be covered. And that's why they don't discuss hand covering. Right? So that's why it's very common for a lot of women, they'll wear niqab, but they will not have cover their hands. Right? Whereas the scholars who hold face to be awra, they will consider hands to be awra as well. I'm not sure if there's a position out there of face being awra and hands not being awra. Allah knows best. But the idea usually comes together. So here, the face covering was made an obligation because of fitna, but not because of awra. Now, what do we do in this situation now? We've got Zahir Riwayah. I mentioned to you another qawl of an early Hanafi scholar who discusses fitna but doesn't say wajib. And then you have all these scholars starting from Naltafi, and you go on, right? Al-Aini maybe Al-Aini discusses it, As-Sunnami discusses it. All these scholars consistently, and even if you go to the Indian subcontinent, this continues with the Mullah Ashfari Tanwi, Mufti Shafi' and so on and so forth, rahimahumullah, Allah mercy all of them. They talk about the wujub of the face covering. Now, you today living wherever you live are presented with this question, or your family member asks you this question, whatever happens, or you go have a wife, whatever. What do you do with this situation? Well, I mean, firstly, what should you do, or what are you allowed to do, or what could you do? These are various questions. So we'll discuss this in the next segment, inshallah. As I thought, this niqab discussion would be more longer, but now we're kind of put to this predicament now, that what do you do in such a situation? Because we have two contrary principles clashing. On the one side, we have the taqsim al-masail, which is Zahir Riwayah. So it should be quite simple. You say, right, what did Imam Abu Hanifa say about this? So Imam Abu Hanifa said that face is not awra, and he specifically says that a man can look at a woman's face and hands as long as not done with shahwa. Therefore, the responsibility goes on the man to lower his gaze. If there's shahwa, there's fitna, you lower your gaze. It's not the woman covering her face is not mentioned as a. It's not the scenario doesn't come that if he has shahwa or there's shahwa, the woman must cover her face. He doesn't mention that, right? So now you have that put there. Okay, we give fatwa on that. But then you got all these texts from the madhab scholars, later scholars, who are saying that it's wajib because of fitna. Right? If you go online, you'll see an article written by what's his name? I forgot the article's name, by Mufti Hussein Qadodia, which is about the Hanafi position on niqab. And there he takes the position that the niqab is wajib, and he lists these scholars. Right? There's a couple of quotations which are a bit like the Maturidi quote is a bit is misquoted, not intentionally, but there's a misquotation there. But the articles online, you can see a list of Hanafi scholars that state about the obligation of face covering. So now you think, well, okay, Zahiri riwayah is here, but then we've got these ulama saying the contrary. And these ulama are saying that times have changed, therefore the fatwa must change. Times have changed, therefore the fatwa must change. So now the fatwa should be of wujub. Right? So if you go by that route, then the answer is wajib. But we left Zahiri riwayah. But there's another twist here, is that some of these Hanafi scholars like Imam al-Natifi, they try to justify their position from Zahiri riwayah as well. How so? That there's a text from Imam Muhammad in Kitab al-Asl where he says that a woman who wants to cover her face in ihram, right, then she would wear something, some sort of covering which is detached from the face. So you have like a hat on and you have something across it, she wears something like that. There, Imam Natifi and some other Hanafis mentioned this. They try to extrapolate from there the obligation of face covering. That Imam Muhammad is saying, even in ihram, this is what you should cover. You can check up the quotations, inshallah. It's not explicit that that's what Imam Muhammad is saying, right? Rather, Imam Muhammad is saying that if she wants to, then this is how she would do it. So if you want to cover her face, this is how you cover it. There's nothing clear indication there where he's saying it's obligation. Rather, clear discussion in Kitab al-Istihsan is showing it's not an obligation, right? So therefore, you're left with the same predicament of Zahiri riwayah versus the change of times. But the changing of times makes sense, right? Because times change, fatwa should change. Everyone accepts that, right? يختلف الفتوى باختلاف الأزمنة والأمكنة. The fatwa changes by the changing of time and places. So therefore, the simple solution is quite simple, is that they're more aware of their time, so that fatwa makes sense. But then if that's the case, then it opens the scope up for us to say, well, can we then give the fatwa based upon our time? Now here, you would have two camps, if you like. And the same answer can apply to other issues as well, but you have two camps then. Because what everyone agrees upon now is that the face is not awrah. And if the face is not awrah, that means that Allah and His Messenger have not obligated face covering in of itself in the according to the Hanafis, right? That Allah has not obligated, and the Messenger have not obligated face covering. But now the question is that because of fitan or change of circumstances, should the obligation now be there? So the scholars who come after are suggesting that if Imam Abu Hanifa was alive today, then he would also set the obligation of face covering, right? So now when you come into the modern period, you have two routes that you can take. One route will be that, as you'd expect, that, well, if there's fitna spoken about by, let's say, Qadi Iyad, the Maliki scholar in the 5th century, 6th century, right, where he's saying time of fitna. Al-Aini is saying time of fitna in the Mamluk era, right? Scholars in the subcontinent saying it's time of fitna. If they were time of fitna, then what level of fitna would there be today when we live in a hypersexual society, in the West at least? Right? I'm just going to speak about the UK, specifically the West, that's where we live, but it's not much different in terms of what people have exposure to, even in the Muslim world. What I mean by this is that even if the society itself may be relatively conservative, but at least what people are exposed to is by internet and TV, is still a high level of exposure to nudity and other such things that was never done in the past. Never there in the past. So therefore, if that was fitna, then there's much more fitna today. So there is much more reason for the obligation of face covering to maintain it. Right? Much more need to maintain the obligation of face covering. And the reason why we can do this is because the position of these Hanafi scholars in the past was not based upon an interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah. It was based upon an interpretation of the societal changes. So they made an observation, they gave a fatwa based upon that. So therefore, one way would be saying that the fatwa still stands, and actually many scholars hold this, right? I think this is actually a dominant position on a lot of the muftis in the Hanafi muftis. They would endorse this. Yes, it makes sense. Now, because the issue is made based on external factors, someone can come along and say, well, all right, because you're living in such a hypersexual society and a person is exposed to so much, cannot a counter argument be made and said, well, if a woman is covering herself properly, with the exception of hands and face, right, that will be far less of a problem and far less of a concern, because she's exposing that much exposed to absolute exposure. So if someone was to go and try to harass someone, the likelihood of, or to go and stare at someone, the likelihood of that person being chosen to be stared at in contrast to all the other people that are far less clothed and living in non-Muslim societies, right, then the fitna will be far less in that situation. Does that make sense, right? In contrast to a society where it's very conservative and people are starting to uncover their faces, and fitna is not so much to do with the women themselves, right? The beauty is about how society is approaching or exposing to themselves to women. So if you're living in a conservative society and one person is uncovering a face, or you're living in a conservative society where women don't come out of their homes, and you've got some women that are coming out of their homes, the fitna will be much worse than in a society where everyone is coming out, everyone is exposed, no one's wearing hijab, and the few that are wearing hijab and covering their awrah properly is far less a fitna than in comparison to the other people that are out there. If that makes sense, right? So looking at it through this avenue lens, there will be a reason to say we can go back to the original obligation of the covering of the whole body except the face and hands, as comes with Zahiri wire. Is that allowed to be done in this situation? Can one make this case? Again, there's two ways to go about this. Number one is to say, well, all the Hanafi scholars have spoken. If you read the Mufti Hussain Kadodia article, this is what he argues. He goes, well, the Hanafi scholars have spoken, so therefore, as a contemporary Hanafi Mufti who has no ability to engage with the Quran and Sunnah directly ourselves, we'll talk about Taqreed and Ijtihad in the last session, inshallah. Therefore, we will have to just stick to what the Imams have said. Maybe not from the Zahiri wire, but the later Imams have said. And the second approach, which makes much more sense to me, is to say, well, the original ruling here that was shifted because of a societal observation. And even if we believe that we are not competent enough to approach the Quran and Sunnah to overrule Imam Hanifa, no problem. But we are competent enough to make societal observations, right? That is still there. So if the change is made not because of some sort of a linguistic interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah that requires a high level of expertise, rather is based upon an observation of one's society and surroundings, then we are also able to give our 2 pence in this situation. So we can turn around and say that the hukam of niqab is that it is not an obligation, it's encouraged, right? And this is the asl position of the madhab, and we can't see a reason for us to change that, because the society we live in, that's my observation. And someone can be also a Hanafi and say, I believe that the fitna, etc., or the need is as much as it was before, the face covering is necessary according to me. Both will be justified in the Hanafi madhab. What is correct will be, correct will be whatever people deem it to be correct. If you're asking me whatever is correct, I think the non-obligation makes much more sense. But the point I'm saying is here, you will see that how the person is trying to mitigate between the Zahiri wire, what the Hanafi scholars have said, and society as well. And how both can be justified using the exact same sources, but coming to different conclusions. And this is intra-madhab, right? Meaning within the madhab discourse. We've not left the madhab yet. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. This was supposed to take one segment. It's taken 2 segments. We'll discuss the topic of women horse riding her time, women cutting their hair in the last segment, inshallah. Right, so with our other case study that we want to look at quickly, right, was the topic of horse riding and cutting hair. So we'll try to do it together, right? So we can see. Actually, let's start with cutting hair first, right? So here we have the scenario. So we say, okay, can women cut their hair, right? Can women cut their hair? So we kind of start with the process again, saying, right, is there anything in Zahiri Riwayah which talks about women cutting their hair? The answer is no. Right, so Imam Abu Hanifa, Sahibain, have not mentioned anything about women cutting their hair in the books of Zahiri Riwayah. What about Nawadir? Is there any transmission from them in Nawadir which suggests the permissibility or impermissibility of cutting the hair for women? And the answer again is no. Then we come across the last tier from the early Taqsim al-Masail that we spoke about, which is Fatawa Mashayikh. And the answer is that in Fatawa Mashayikh there is a fatwa. There is a fatwa, and that's given by the early Hanafi scholar Abu Bakr Iskaf. Abu Bakr Iskaf is a senior early Hanafi scholar from the Mashayikh of the Madhab, early Mashayikh of the Madhab. And he's asked this question regarding women cutting their hair and doing it for one's husband, and he says that it is impermissible for women cut their hair, right? Because this is I can't remember if he says it in the text itself, but it's impermissible for women cutting their hair because this is an act of disobedience to Allah Ta'ala. And then he says, لا طاعة للمخلوق في معصية خالق. There is no obedience for the creation in the disobedience to the Creator. So if the husband requests so, the woman can't cut her hair. Right? And the rationale behind that is because this is tashabbuh bil rijal. Now, based upon that, right, that fatwa, that means that women, as the fatwa says, are not allowed to cut their hair. Women are not allowed to cut their hair. And you'll find later on Hanafi scholars like Imam Haskafi in Dur al-Mukhtar, I believe also in Bahr Raiq, right, Ibn Nujaym, they cite this fatwa of Abu Bakr Iskaf, and they say and they just cite it, and they say that the woman who cuts her hair, athimat, she's sinful, right? She's sinful, and there's nothing mentioned in here to suggest that if it's a small amount or a large amount, just says that she is sinful for doing so. It's impermissible. Therefore, if you're following the method in the Hanafi madhab, the answer is quite simple. Can women cut their hair? The answer is no. Right? The answer is no. But let's make, naturally, as I said, that would be the process that you follow, but things get more complicated when further questions are asked and things are probed. Now, it does seem that historically, and Allah knows best, because a lot of these Hanafi societies, we don't really know what the women were doing in their, or how society was running on a day-to-day affair. Allah knows best. But what we can say, at least for the subcontinent, that growing one's hair long, or women having long hair, was considered as a form of zina and something that every woman will try to strive towards. So having like short hair for a woman up to her shoulders, etc., was not something that was deemed as a appropriate practice, even if it was not deemed as even though they may not see as haram or a shari'i hukam, but it was understood as being inappropriate for women only about 50 years ago, 40 years ago in the subcontinent to be cutting their hair. And I can't speak about other societies, but when I do ask, they say generally that is the case. So there's not going to be much of a concern, because there's no want from women to see, in this case at least, I can't prove this case, I'm just saying, right? It seems there's no want for women to cut their hair, and therefore there's no reason to actually, look into this fatwa anymore. And that's it kind of works together. Women are cutting their hair anyway, it's permissible to cut their hair, it works great. But in more recent times, we see that there's a pushback. People ask questions, they say, why? Women can't cut their hair, why? So you say, well, the madhab has said so. That's great, but what did Imam Abu Hanifa say? So there's nothing Imam Abu Hanifa. Nothing with Sahibain. Okay. So if a fatwa of a scholar came, so some Hanafi scholars mentioned that, where did they get it from? Is there a hadith that prohibits, or ayah of the Quran that prohibits women from cutting their hair? And the answer is no. Right? There are prohibitions of women shaving their hair off. Right? That's fine. But trimming their hair, there isn't any. Rather, there's some hadith of the which suggests to the contrary, like the wives of Nabi cutting their hair. So how does one, reconcile between the two? It becomes an issue. One way to reconcile now, again, the two ways you can approach. One is say, well, I'm sorry, but it's not our job to engage in the Quran and Sunnah. The scholars of the madhab have mentioned it, and we will say the same thing. Right? That's one way you can go and say that I'm just not competent enough to say anything. This is what they've said. I stop at that. But if you want to engage with them, you can say that, all right, the fatwa of a sheikh has to go back to his usul. So the usul that's cited here is the shabab al-rijal. There's imitating men. So if it's imitating men, again, now there's a sub two ways of explaining it. So some Hanafi scholars who want to maintain the prohibition of cutting the hair, they said, when you're saying it's imitating men, it's the act of cutting hair which is imitating men. It's not the hairstyle which is imitating men, it's the act of cutting. Men cut hair, women don't cut hair. Head hair, that is. Right? That's fine, but is there any dalil for this? Is there any evidence for this? And the answer is no. There's no evidence to say that women cut hair, don't cut hair, men cut head hair. There's no such thing as that. Therefore, the only reasonable explanation here would be that the shawb rijal is that the hair should not look like that of a man. So a woman's hair must be different to men's hair, so therefore there should be some length to the woman's hair. That makes her look feminine, that shows that she's a woman. Anything less that makes her male-like or confuses her with a man will be deemed as impermissible. In that case then, if a woman has very long hair and she has to trim it a bit, they'll be allowed for her to do so. As long as she looks like a woman and is not imitating men. If that's the case, then what we've done here, have we gone against the madhab? The answer is no. Right? We have tried to explain the madhab in light of in light of the usul of the madhab and try to apply it. Okay, but again, you have these two different approaches. Now, as you can see quite clearly which approach I prefer, but the other approach is there as well. And some people would prefer that approach, and that's fine. Like some of those approaches, when it comes to like masail of salah or some technical issues and stuff, you don't look into it, that's fine. But in these kind of masail in which like a masail, odd masail of salah, etc., which are very specific, where you may just take the technical answers if they said it, you don't really understand it. But in these kind of answers in which affect the day-to-day life of many people, that's why we're restricting on just this case of women-related issues, right? That affects a lot of women, most women. Then there needs to be some, these kind of points will have to be challenged, and therefore an answer will be required to suffice that. So if you want to make this kind of prohibition of people, you have to be expected for one to justify it. Now, if you're going to say that a scholar in the 3rd century gave fatwa on this, or this Haskafi said this, or this scholar said this, and then you can't justify it based on the usul, it'll be very difficult to convince people. Right? So this is why you can give these kind of answers and just trying to show you the scope in which you can work with. The third mas'ala was women horse riding. Right? Again, we can apply now, so we go to the same principle. So is there anything in Zahiri riwayah? The answer is no. Right? There's nothing in Zahiri riwayah about it. There's a text from Sarakhsi, which some people confuse as being from, I think it's Sir Kabir, but the actual narration seems to be from Sarakhsi himself. And then you have nothing in Nawadir that I'm aware of, nothing in Fatawa of the Mashayikh that I'm aware of. Allah knows best, maybe there is, right? But you do have Hanafi scholars, like I mentioned, Sarakhsi, etc. They mention the prohibition of this, and they cite the hadith, لَعْنَ اللَّهُ الْفُرُوجَ عَلَى السُّرُوجِ, that the Messenger of Allah ﷺ said that may Allah curse the women who ride upon saddles. Right? So therefore, it's prohibited for women to horse ride or ride on camels, etc. because of that. The problem with here is that here, firstly, it's not Imam Hanifa or Sahibin who cite the hadith. This is a later scholars who cite the hadith, and the hadith is not authentic at all. Therefore, why is it prohibited for women to horse ride? So now we have to attach it to an asl in the madhab or asl in Islam. Asl in these usul that I'm going to mention are generally for asl in Islam, right? So the main usul they say is that it's fitna, right? It's fitna for women to ride horses or camels, because of the way that the horse maneuvers. It's not appropriate for a woman to be riding horses. If that's the case, which is fair enough, then that would mean that it's only prohibited for women to ride horses and camels in front of men, right? And it's only prohibited if they cannot conceal themselves. If there's a way for them to conceal their bodies, then it's fine. And if there's no men around, then it should be fine also. Right? Some have added in the saying that this is to protect the virgin from her hymen being broken. Let's assume that that's a valid reason, right? Then this hukam would only apply to virgins. The married woman would not have to have an issue with this. You see, right? So this is examples. I'm just giving some women-related issues. We don't have that much time, but like I said, there's a lot of discussion on all these topics, right? But the point being is that with these 3 case studies, you can see how you can maneuver through the madhab, and where you have scope to debate, right? Where you don't have scope to debate, when Imam Hanifa mentions something, you can't. So now, for example, in the niqab issues, you can't change the awra debate, because if you change the awra debate, you're going outside the madhab. If you say the face is awra, that's outside the madhab now. Fine, you can take that position, but that's outside the madhab. But there you can't maneuver there. But in other cases where the imams have not explicitly said anything, the scope of maneuvering, etc., is much more free. Right? And we can refer back to the usul. But as you see, you always have these kind of other approaches which are a bit more literal, where they'll say that the mufti, they'll belittle the role of the mufti very much and say you should just be citing what earlier scholars have cited. Right? And that has worked in the past, but I think now, because people have access to actually know where you're getting this information from, they'll be like, well, I don't want to accept that because it doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't coincide with the usul that we know, and so on and so forth. In conclusion of today's lesson is that we've looked at 3 scenarios which are women-related issues. We'll look at other situations, issues as well, which are women-related issues, and how, once we've kind of understood the backdrop of the madhab and taqsim al-masail, and how people say certain things, the variables that come into play. So where you have Zahiri way in place, where you have Fatawa the Mashayikh, the application of usul, the application of urf, ada, right? You can add in the umum al-balwa and so on and so forth, right? Which are like general concerns. So for example, the issue of, let's say, if you're living in a society where everyone is riding horses, it's the way to travel, right? People are poor, they can't afford, other forms of transport. We need to travel as well. Then how strong or harsh would you be on that fatwa? You see, so if you're saying that women are not allowed to ride horses as like a mutlaq hukam, you want to even extend that onto, let's say, cars, whatever, right? Then the question would be, well, if there's a need, how strong should you be on that fatwa? Right? So just working within the madhab, when you know where the origins of the madhab or the position is, you know how much flexibility you have, you know what the rationale is and where you can be flexible on. So that's why when we talk about women, is the face awra or not, there we have an explicit interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah from Imam Abu Hanifa. It's an explicit interpretation of Imam Abu Hanifa saying that face is not awra. So that, as a Hanafi, will be unquestionable. That is what your Imam has said. If you want to take an alternative position, you have to leave the madhab in that position. So we start off as Hanafis on the premise of Imam Hanifa's interpretation of Quran and Sunnah. Now, when it comes to other secondary explanations, or explanation based on external factors, like society and urf and aada and gender relations, etc., then, as you see in the latter 2 cases, there's more freedom in which a person can engage with that, because of the fact that, number 1 is there's no explicit interpretation of Abu Hanifa of the Quran and Sunnah at play that we are bound by, and number 2 is that the usul themselves, that the shawb rijal, the shawb nisa, fitna, etc., these are quite a wider concept. So if you're saying, like you said, horse riding is fitna, then that's fine. Then the fitna will be for men, in front of men. So if it's a women-only session, no problem. You see the issue here, right? So this is why when we look at these case studies, these variables come into play. Naturally, right, I have positions on these, and you can quite clearly see which positions I highlight. So, but you're more than welcome to go online or ask other muftis to see if I've missed anything. But for the niqab, there's books on this. I mentioned the 2 works for you to check out. On the latter 2 points, I've not really seen any books, but you can see online fatawa, and you can weigh up the arguments, etc. yourself, inshallah. So that will conclude our 10th session. We'll spend a few more lessons like this going through certain case studies to get us a better understanding of how different variables come into play. And then we're going to have a session on Hanafi fiqh in the subcontinent, because of the Urdu Fatawa, which have had a major impact on the world, and the Hanafi world specifically. And then last session we'll look at the issue of taqleed and ijtihad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.